How you doing? Good to see you all today. Big crowd, sunny day. Right, so I'm going to be talking for about an hour on basically how the West became self-obsessed. And I'm going to be talking in kind of three different sections. First, we're going to start talking about the kind of the deep roots of our kind of human self, where it all came from. Then we're going to be sort of moving forward to talk about kind of specifically how culture works, like how culture kind of interacts with that kind of deep universal self. And then I'm going to be talking a bit about kind of the very modern age, the kind of late 20th and 21st century, to really kind of talk about how we've ended up in the place which we are at now. Right, so let's begin by talking about kind of the human self in its kind of more universal kind of form, really. So human beings are an ape. Like obviously we're not like an ape, we are an actual ape. But we're a weird, odd kind of ape in that we're highly social. So the reason that we've managed to kind of take over the world and kind of outperform all the other apes quite spectacularly is that we're unbelievably good at working together. So all living things, want to pursue their Darwinian aims, survival and reproduction, and all living things have their own particular unique strategy for doing that thing. And our unique strategy is essentially to kind of join groups and join cooperative groups and then compete with other cooperative groups, and that's what we do. So for more than 95%, some psychologists say more than 99% of our time on Earth, we've not been living in towns and cities and villages. We've been living in hunter-gatherer tribes, these cooperative groups, kind of roaming around the territory, foraging, hunting, and occasionally sometimes attacking and being attacked by other kind of human groups. So that's our kind of basic kind of universal self. We're tribal. We think in groups, and that's kind of all of us. And it's kind of our original sin, really. Religious people talk about the idea of original sin, and I think it's kind of true in the sense that we can't not think in groups. I think of it a bit like a cake mixer. If you throw eggs into a cake mixer and turn the cake mixer on, it's going to do something to those eggs. And it's the same with the human self. If you turn a human brain on and chuck reality into it, it's going to do something to that reality. And that's experience itself as a member of a group or groups, and kind of feel kind of competitive with other groups. And that's kind of thought to be the basis of the kind of universal human morality. So fundamentally, kind of what's at the core of all our kind of moral rules around the world is the idea of selflessness. So we celebrate selflessness, and the stories that we tell, the heroes are usually selfless in some way, and the villains are usually selfish in some way. And the reason for that is that we're tribal. We wanted to encourage selfless behaviour. People that put their own interests before that of their tribe would get a bad reputation. They'd be punished, and we'd tell gossipy stories about them. We'd feel moral outrage. They're the villains. So if you think about villains in storytelling, they're often selfish. They're often kind of acting on their own selfish desires at the expense of everybody else. And you flip that over, and heroes are often selfless. They're kind of selflessly courageous, or they sacrifice themselves or something. They kind of put their own interest to one side on behalf of the group. So that kind of selfish, selfless is one of those kind of human universals. Is at the basis of all kind of human cultures is that kind of access. The other kind of big inheritance of our tribal self is the idea that we're all obsessed with status. Lots of animals, of course, are interested in status, and lots of animals are always kind of hustling to increase their own sense of relative status, because with status comes lots of things that enable us to achieve our Darwinian aims even better. So in human groups, the more status you get, the higher you climb on that little status ladder, the better your access to kind of better mates, kind of higher value mates, the better your access to safe sleeping sites, the better your access to better food. So kind of that idea of status is this kind of heuristic. It's this kind of golden key that we know subconsciously, that if you get more status, everything gets better. So we're all kind of hustling for kind of status. And humans have this kind of amazing second way of getting status. So lots of animals compete for status, relative status, with dominance. So they just fight, basically, or the older member of the group gets more status. But humans have invented this whole new way of getting status, and it's with prestige. So it's an amazing kind of invention, prestige. It's kind of human thing where we can gain status by being impressive, by being more moral, by in kind of inventing things, by doing things that are useful. So we're all, you know, that's a big part of human life, is that kind of hustle for status, and we kind of flip often, you know, sometimes in the blink of an eye, between getting status with dominance, being a kind of aggressive, and being kind of morally judgmental and trying to kind of force our ideas on other people. And then, as far as I'm concerned, when humans are being at their best, you know, we're competing with prestige by being, you know, inventing new things, coming up with new ideas, you know, and being kind of better people. So that's the kind of the basic idea of who we are as kind of human beings. That's the kind of the kind of stuff that's in there when we're born. So when we're born, as humans, we have brains that are sometimes known as experience expectant. So they're kind of half-formed brains, that they have these kind of basic understandings about how the world works, kind of baked into them: status, connection with tribes, all that stuff. And then we have these extremely extended childhoods. So we're not like giraffes that can just sort of get born and you know, stagger away and be kind of roughly okay without their parents. You know, it takes a long time for a human being to be independent. And neuroscientists, they keep putting back the age at which the human brain is finally stopped kind of developing in that way, and it's currently at the mid-20s. So it's quite extraordinary how long that takes. And kind of what's happening there is that we're learning the rules of our local culture. We're learning the rules of our tribe, essentially. So when humans are born, their brains are basically asking one really important question. And that question is, who do I have to be in this particular place in order to achieve my Darwinian aims of getting along and getting ahead? And what kind of person do I have to be? What are the rules of this culture? And of course, if we look back in human history, the rules of culture, you know, just are constantly in flux. They're constantly changing, not only geographically but in time. You know, we look back in for kind of the moral rules of British culture 100 years ago. We find many of them abhorrent. But of course, if you were a human being in that era, it would have felt perfectly natural. It would have felt as kind of obvious to you, as obvious as our moral understandings and moral truths seem to us today. So that idea is sometimes known as dual inheritance. Human beings have this dual inheritance. We're kind of run by these two separate sets of instructions. One's genetic. You know, it's baked into our genes, those kind of tribal ideas about how we ought to behave as people. And then on top of that, there's culture. You know, we humans have these amazingly complex cultures, which are kind of full of kind of a separate set of rules which tell us who we have to be, or what kind of things we have to believe, how we should dress, the kind of jobs we should have, all of that stuff. So that's culture. And so, of course, if we're wanting to kind of understand how and why the West is particularly self-obsessed at the moment, we need to look at kind of the history of Western culture. And the big change for us is thought to be, of course, in ancient Greece. Lots of the ideas about individualism kind of stem from ancient Greece. There's the historian, Professor Werner Jaeger, says that what happened in ancient Greece, the idea that kind of that came out of that area was the beginning of a new conception of the value of the individual, that each soul is in itself an end of infinite value. So that idea of individualism, and it's quite an amazing idea because, as I said, you know, for eons, for such a long time, for all of human history, we'd experience ourselves as members of groups, and it's groups. I'm a member of this group, and it's groups against groups. But this idea that actually the locus of interest, the locus of change, the locus of importance should be the individual is quite a radical idea, and so of course psychologists are very interested in kind of the roots of that idea, the kind of how did it happen, and kind of what does it actually mean. So some of these psychologists call this kind of whole kind of nexus of ideas the geography of thought. This idea of how we experience ourselves as a cultural animal comes out of the literal kind of geography, the kind of the landscape of the people we were some time ago. And so when you look at kind of ancient Greece is, well, it's like it is now. It's not like an island as you'd imagine it. It's not like a country as you'd imagine a country to be now. It's not like a land, like a coherent landmass. It's kind of a weird, kind of desiccated, atomized kind of landscape. Lots of little islands, lots of kind of isolated communities at the sort of foot of rocky mountains. Not a lot of room for agriculture in ancient Greece. Anybody who's been to Greece on holiday, obviously it's the same now as it was then. You're not going to do much kind of rice growing or wheat growing or livestock rearing in Greece. It was made up of about 1,000 individual city-states. There's kind of 1,000 different kind of places that you could go to. And one of the kind of ramifications of that is that it already kind of encourages this kind of freedom. When people upset other people in ancient Greece, they could just escape to another city-state and kind of begin again. But the more important idea that comes out of that is how how in ancient Greece you would have had to have behaved in order to fulfill those two Darwinian aims. So if you were born in ancient Greece, who do I have to be in this place in order to get along with other people in my tribe and get ahead to kind of win that status battle? And in ancient Greece, because of its landscape, because you couldn't do much farming there, you had to be a kind of a hustler. You had to kind of be, kind of tend the 6 olive trees in your back lot, or make olive oil, or lots of them are fishermen, would go out and fish, or kind of tan hides, or write poetry, or trade with other city-states. So it's kind of a hustling kind of, the landscape forced people to be these kind of hustlers, to kind of have these kind of little units of industry that would kind of get along like that. And of course, this generates an ideal of self. This generates a kind of culture in which that kind of idea of the individualistic hustler is worshipped and idealized. And then so we see lots of interesting cultural ideas that we can still see that are ubiquitous across the West now, emerged in ancient Greece. So they'd have statues of idealized male and female forms who wouldn't look out of place on the front of magazines today. One of the kind of particularly odd things that I found when I was doing my research was that one of the things that you see on idealised masculine forms in ancient Greece is this thing called the pelvic V line, which if you've seen Love Island, you know what that is. It's that thing there. And they're very hard to get in real life. It's very tough to get a pelvic V line. I've never had one. And if you take an ancient Greek statue of a sexy man, he could be on Men's Health Today if he wasn't made of stone. They look exactly the same. These ideas. So that's one of the kind of things that comes out of ancient Greece. Then there's another idea which is quite a toxic idea. They called it kalokagathia. And kalokagathia means roughly beautiful and good. And that's the idea that you can make a moral judgment about how good somebody is inside by looking at how they were physically. If they were attractive, they were a good person, and if they were ugly, they were a bad person. So a really terrible idea, kalokagathia, really awful, but one that's still ubiquitous in the West today. And obviously we have the Olympics, we have this amazing battle of self against self. Debating becomes a popular pastime in ancient Greece. For 50 years they had democracy in Athens, which is just extraordinary when you think this was 2,500 years ago. This was like Game of Thrones world, and they they experimented with democracy in a kind of early form. Of course, it was only rich men that were able to vote, but that was what was going on there. So that's that. I mean, it was ancient Greeks, of course, that had to come up with the story of Narcissus, this individual who saw his reflection in a pool of water and fell in love with him. He was so handsome, he fell in love with himself. And when he found that it was, when he realized it was only a reflection and he couldn't marry himself, he kind of dies of depression. So the warning about self-love comes out of ancient Greece. Aristotle had this idea that he said that things have unique properties that can be defined and categorized and act predictably according to certain laws. So he said an apple that falls to the ground does so under the force of gravity, which was a great idea. But he also thought that an apple floats on the sea under the power of levity, which of course was a less good idea. But you can see these are kind of they're kind of groping towards what we'd understand science, the scientific process to be now. They're kind of understanding that individual things have individual kind of properties that you can measure, and you can judge the individual thing under these kind of measurements. Aristotle also believed that everything in nature was on this natural path towards perfection. And everything in nature, of course, includes human beings. And human beings are also on a natural path towards perfection. And he believed that lots of ancient people in ancient Greece believed that education was the way that people should be on this path to self-improvement and be on the way to kind of perfecting themselves. And Aristotle believed that you should, in order to kind of actualize your natural path towards perfection, you had to kind of conduct yourself in a state of ennobled self-love, which was a very interesting idea, that you should love yourself. And of course, that becomes an extremely important idea in the modern West. So it's kind of the self-esteem movement in a very kind of early form. So that's kind of ancient Greece, and you can see so much of modern Western culture in those ideas in ancient Greece. That it's that celebrity culture, the adoration of the individual, the kind of the slippage into narcissism that was sometimes seen. This idea of in kind of natural progress, that things are on their natural path towards progress. And if you have been raised in the West. And if you haven't, you might sort of hear all these things and go, well, that's not a Western thing. That's just how it is to be. That's just obvious. All this stuff is self-evident. This isn't a particularly interesting cultural idea. And that's why psychologists are particularly interested in comparing ancient Greek ideas with what was going on in roughly the same time in China, in East Asia, because East Asia, China specifically, was completely the opposite landscape to ancient Greece. It's a big landlocked country, and it's not. One of the things about ancient Greece was it's very hard for a tyrant to take over ancient Greece because it's all these little individual city-states, and they're all separated by mountains and cliffs and waterways. And so it's very hard. So tyrants couldn't very difficult to take over all of ancient Greece. But China, it was much easier for kind of tyrannical figures to kind of dominate that landscape. And in order to kind of get along and get ahead in China, the landscape encouraged kind of collective behaviour. So whilst in ancient Greece at the time everybody was, these little being kind of industrious kind of hustlers with their little small industries. In China, you were likely to either be a wheat grower, which is a very group-intensive activity, a rice grower, which is an even more group-intensive activity, or they had these incredible irrigation projects that were being built at the time, and you'd be working on that, which again is another extremely group-intensive pastime. So that means that if you're born in China 2,500 years ago and your brain is asking that kind of eternal question, who do I have to be in this place in order to get along and get ahead, you get a very different answer. And that's, I've got to be somebody that completely privileges the group. I've got to keep my head down, because if the group is successful, I'm successful. But if I'm kind of pushy and I kind of elevate myself above the group, then it's going to create discord and the group's going to fall to pieces, and that's terrible. So that's the ideal of self that becomes raised up in ancient China. So, and at the time, as you've got Aristotle kind of walking around ancient Greece talking about we should conduct ourselves in a state of ennobled self-love, at roughly the same time, you had this amazing guy, Confucius, walking around China, who has a completely different conception of what the kind of idealized person, how they should behave. He said, the superior individual has nothing to compete for, but if he must compete, he does it in an archery match, wherein he ascends to his position bowing in deference. He does not boast of himself, preferring instead the concealment of his virtue, which he cultivates in a friendly harmony and lets the states of equilibrium and harmony exist in perfection. So completely different kind of conception of self back in China. One of the things that I found extraordinary when I was doing my research was this this book which said that there were no, this idea of sort of me being the centre of the universe was so alien to ancient Chinese ideals, that ideas of reality, that there was no autobiography in China for like 2 millennia. And when there was, so the idea to a Westerner of an impressive famous person writing a book about them and telling their story just seems obvious. Like, of course we want to do that, but it wasn't to the ancient Chinese. And when books like that stories like that do start appearing, the person who the story is about isn't at the centre of the story at all. They're kind of on the periphery looking in, as if they're kind of accidental spectators upon their own life. So really extraordinary kind of differences in kind of culture emerge out of these changes. And the really extraordinary stuff is that psychologists who get people in the laboratory and do various tests on how they experience reality, even today it kind of reflects these ancient differences which appear to come out of the landscape. So a lot of these tests, for some reason, involve animations of fish tanks, which sounds like a mad thing, but go with me on this. So what they do is, you might know this already, but if you don't, so the way that we kind of experience reality is that our eyes are in constant motion. We have this tiny little speck at the center of our eyes, which is kind of full color and high definition, and it darts about the environment very rapidly, building up our impression of the world. So these are called saccades. So the fastest movement in the human body, and we do 4 to 5 saccades every second. So we do that's about 250,000 every day. So we're always kind of saccading. And what psychologists, neuroscientists do is they can put these special spectacles on you, which measure and record the movement of your saccades. So they can see what your brain's deciding to focus on and how it's building up its model of the world. And so in one of these sort of very iconic experiments, there's an animation of a fish tank, and in the middle of the fish tank, there's this sort of show-off, flashy orange fish dominating the kind of scene, and there's all the other fish are kind of dotted around it. And they find that the Westerner is much more likely to focus on that individualistic, flashy show-off fish at the front, whereas the East Asian person is much more likely to look at the fish and then look at everything else in context. And so when you take them out of the laboratory and you say to them, what did you see? The Westerner is much more likely to say, I saw a fish. And the East Asian person is much more likely to say, well, I saw a fish tank and there's a bunch of fish in there and there was a big fish at the front. And then you say to them, so tell me about that fish at the front. What do you think about that fish at the front? And the Westerner is more likely to go, well, that fish was the leader. That was the boss man. I like that fish. And the East Asian person is more likely to go, well, I felt sorry for that fish because they're obviously being pushed out of the group and they're obviously a bit lonely and something's gone wrong for that fish. So you can see how out of these very fundamental differences in how we understand the world, differences in values that are really important emerge out of these things. And so we begin to experience a very different moral reality. As Susan Cain famously kind of talked about in her book, Quiet, in East Asia, shyness is seen as a leadership quality. Whereas in the West, shyness is seen as like a deficit almost in the kind of corporate kind of playground environment. Richard Nisbett, the very famous psychologist who kind of pioneered all this stuff, he said to me when I interviewed him, he said, you've only got to see the average street scene you go to Mongkok or, in Hong Kong, or you go to Tokyo, because East Asian people are far more aware of things, the context, and the idea of reality as this kind of constellation of elements rather than simple individual kind of blocks, that the East Asian street scenes are sometimes feel chaotic to the average Westerner. It's like you get this massive endorphin rush. It's like, oh my God. So different environments are kind of built out of this. One of the studies has looked at the ways that crimes are reported in East Asia versus the West. And one of the studies looked at how some spree killings were reported. And in the Western individualistic newspapers are far more likely to pin the blame for the spree killing on the individual. This is a bad person, they were evil, they were nasty, terrible, 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 evil, nasty person. Whereas in the Chinese newspapers are far more likely to talk about the context. Well, they just lost their job and they've had an argument with their boss, so they're far more aware of the kind of contextual situations of things. So really interesting stuff, and amazing how these different value systems really do seem to have emerged out of the ways we were having to get along and get ahead 2,500 years ago. So that's that. I'm gonna sort of brush over a few thousand years because we've only got an hour. We've only got half an hour left. But just to say that what happens in the West after the fall of the ancient world is that we go into really the Dark Ages. Christianity sweeps in. In Britain, we're feudal. 10% of the population are slaves or serfs who are effectively slaves. Not good, bad. And this idea comes in from the Middle East that we have original sin, that humans are bad. We are awful, terrible people, and it fits perfectly with how we had to get along and get ahead in the Middle Ages. it was feudal. We had to be completely subservient to the lord of the manor, who our survival depended on, and the lord of the manor is kind of externalized into this kind of domineering Lord God, who we also had to kind of bow and be subservient to. And as part of my research, I went to stay in a monastery in Scotland, where it's a Benedictine monastery where they're still living effectively as if they were 800 years ago. And they were singing all these psalms in Latin, and I was looking at the translations, and it was things like "I am but a worm," really like, they just hated themselves. They were just terrible. And the idea was, God had decided your fate. You're a man, you're a woman, you're a peasant, whatever. It's bad to have any ambition beyond those limitations. A good, morally good person knows their place and stays within it. And that was life for a very, very long time. Traditional kind of histories of the world and of the West often see the birth of psychology as the break with this, and talk about Freud a lot. But to my estimation, that's a kind of, if we're talking about self-obsession specifically, Freud really was just a continuation of the Christians. He also believed in original sin, but he believed that we were all these perverts who wanted to kind of sleep with our mums and murder our dads, and we had penis envy and womb envy. So he still thought ultimately the humans were bad. We were terrible, and in order to kind of cure humans, we had to kind of cure ourselves with psychotherapy. The real break comes in America, this great new land, this kind of new version of ancient Greece, whereas ancient Greece was 1,000 individual city-states. America is 50, states who are all kind of essentially independent, although, combined with a kind of overall kind of government. And in the kind of post-war years, a new idea emerges, a revolutionary, radical idea, which was called the human potential movement. And the idea is that all those Christians, Freud and all those guys were just wrong. Humans aren't terrible. Humans are amazing. They're fantastic. They're wonderful. And the only reason they're not fantastic and wonderful is because they're kind of bossed about and ruined and polluted by culture and society. They're made to feel guilty. They're made to feel kind of reined in. And it's from this kind of nexus ideas that ideas that are still very dominant today emerge. So one of the ideas that is very dominant today is about the idea of authenticity, that we should be authentic. And because the individual is perfect, if we're authentically us, that's fine. So if anybody here, probably no one's going to admit to ever watching Big Brother or all these reality shows, but if you do, what you'll see very often is people behave appallingly to each other. They bully each other, they're rude, they're obnoxious, and when they're pulled up on it, the answer usually comes, well, I'm just being me. It's just me. You should just accept me. And that's a human potential idea. That's the idea that we're all amazing underneath it all. And as long as we're being authentic, we're being morally kind of correct. So one of the sort of main progenitors of this idea was a guy called Carl Rogers. And it really is a kind of a rebirth of those ancient Greek ideas about self-love, that in order that we're all on this journey towards individual perfection, and in order to achieve it, we just have to love ourselves. And this is kind of a niche idea throughout the kind of hippie years. It's kind of a niche idea in psychology. It's very kind of Californian. There's a place that you might have heard of on the West Coast called the Esalen Institute, which was the kind of intellectual kind of cauldron of the hippie generation. And a lot of these ideas, it's where Don Draper ended up at the end of Mad Men, if there's any Mad Men fans here. And so that's where all these ideas are all kind of bubbling away. And they kind of stay a bit niche and a bit kind of esoteric until the 1980s. And the 1980s is when these ideas become mainstream. And in order to kind of realize why, you just have to think about what was going on in ancient Greece and China 2,500 years ago. So the idea there is that again, the brain's asking that fundamental question: who do I have to be in this place in order to get along and get ahead? So 2,500 years ago, that question was defined by our physical environment, because we were living off the land, we were controlled by the land. And of course, in the 1980s, in this kind of post-industrial revolution, kind of scientific age, we're not tethered to the land anymore. So the big controlling force that kind of defines who we are becomes the economy. It's the rules of the economy that define who we have to be and how we have to behave in order to get along and get ahead. So before the 1970s, is a surprisingly kind of collectivist era in Western life. And this was another surprise to me when I was doing my research. And it seems to be that the big disasters in the early part of the 20th century knocked us into being a bit more collective. They kind of knocked some sense into us. So, you know, the Great Depression, the Second World War, they kind of knocked us into these kind of very collective ideas, like in America, the great road building projects, lots of regulations on banking and building and industry, things like the GI Bill, which was an enormously kind of fantastic kind of socialist really idea that anybody that served in the military gets a free college education, did a kind of enormous amount of good. And of course, over here in the UK, we had the welfare state after the Second World War, pensions, NHS, all that good stuff. And again, what comes out of these kind of collective ideas in the US and in the UK is a collective sense of collective self. So in the early post-war years, it was the kind of the year of corporation man and woman, the rise of the suburbs. Everybody kind of the kind of great fear at the time was that we were all becoming kind of identikit humans. And the corporation man and woman had children, and those children were even more collectivist. They were hippies. They were completely anti-materialistic, anti-corporate, anti the man. They didn't want to own things. They just wanted all to be equal, and they wanted to sit around smoking pot and having a good time, and why not? And then, of course, the 70s happens, and everything starts going wrong. The economy starts falling to pieces. Economists still argue as to why that happened, but that's not really important to us right now. But what's important is that the politicians of the 70s and 80s had to come up with a new idea, a new way to run our economy, a new way to kind of run the economies of the West. And the idea they fell upon, old Thatcher and Reagan, was neoliberalism. This idea that we want to kind of return to these ancient Greek ideals, really, and that is that we want to get rid of all these collectivist policies, get rid of all this banking and business and welfare state as much as possible, and turn all of human life into a competition of self against self. So that's what Thatcher and Reagan did. There's a really quite chilling interview with Margaret Thatcher that I found in 1981. She gave to the Sunday Times. And the interviewer said to her, "So what's your big idea, Maggie Thatcher? What's your plan?" And she said, well, I'm paraphrasing a bit. She said, well, you know, what's annoyed me about all the policies over the last sort of 10, 20 years is they've all been towards the collectivist state. And then she said something really, really bone-chilling. She said, the project is economics, but the object is to change the soul. And that's chilling because that's exactly what she did. By changing the rules of how we get along and get ahead, with this kind of neoliberal project, she changed who we are, because that's how it works. And psychologists hadn't worked out that that's how it works, and they hadn't done at the 80s. They wouldn't do until the 21st century. So what happened? Well, I'm sure you're all familiar with the story. We had the miners' strike over here, the great totemic battle against the unions, which destroyed the power of the unions. In America, they had a very similar battle with the air traffic controllers union, which I didn't know about, which was the kind of same idea. Reagan had this big totemic battle against the unions. In the collectivist era, economists call that era the Great Compression, by the way. It is the Great Compression because there was not a lot of difference between, relatively speaking, between the top earners and the bottom earners. So it's a great compression in earnings. And all of the regulations that enable that to happen were kind of removed. Of course, removing those regulations from banking ultimately led to the great financial crisis of 2008, so that was a really terrible idea. During the Great Compression years, the top rate of income tax in the United States was 91%. Extraordinary. So of course all that was changed, and we get this kind of new era of unbelievable competition in the early 80s. And the effect it has on the Western self is really dramatic, and it happens really, really rapidly. So one of the kind of more interesting studies I read was a study of how babies' names have changed throughout the decades. And what they found, the psychologists, is that in 1982, we start changing how we're naming our children. So for decades before that, children would have been called, you know, Victoria and Margaret and George, you know, all those standard names. But in 1982, we started giving our children weird names, like weird spellings, Nick Kershaw without a C in it, or like, you know, brand new names, because the idea was we wanted our children to stand out and be a star. The early 80s was the era of, you know, the Jane Fonda workout video, which sold millions of copies. It was the Green Goddess, the Keep Fit Revolution, which of course, you know, all about looking, that Kalagathia idea, we've got to look perfect in this kind of new competitive world. And again, of course, that's not leftist, this is called wellness now. It's the same idea. And if you really want to think about how how rapid these changes were, just think about who we were in the kind of 60s and 70s versus who we were in 1985, say. So we'd gone from being these anti-capitalistic, fuck the man hippies to, you know, pinging our red braces down Wall Street going, greed is good. And I know it's a massive generalization, but, you know, cultural-wise, in that general way, that's what happened. It's an enormous revolution in who we were, and it all pins on those decisions made in the late 70s and early 80s to radically change the economy, so radically change the rules by which we were to get along and get ahead. So into this kind of new competitive world emerges a man I want to spend sort of 5 or 10 minutes talking about, because if there's one person who apart from Thatcher and Reagan, did more than any to kind of create this slightly narcissistic world we're in right now, it's a man called John Vasconcellos. So John Vasconcellos was a Californian politician, and he was raised Catholic. So he was raised in a very strict Catholic family, very anti-self-esteem, very anti-self-glorification. He was always taught in that Catholic way to kind of hate yourself. And then he had a massive nervous breakdown, went to Esalen, met Carl Rogers, and became absolutely evangelical about the idea of the human potential movement, because he felt that it changed his life. You know, like, I've learnt there's nothing wrong with self-esteem. In fact, it's the best thing ever. We should love ourselves. The authentic self is just, you know, the ideal we should all be kind of moving towards. So, you know, there was lots of people who thought that, who came out of Esalen, but John Vasconcellos happened to be the second most powerful man in California. He was chairman of the Ways and Means Commission. And he thought, well, you know what, I know this is true about self-esteem, and I'm in a position of power. So I'm going to, I want to, you know, start having this idea about self-esteem informing how we're running our schools and our prisons and our institutions, and therefore I can kind of help California become better. So he proposed that he would launch a 3-year investigation into the kind of the science of self-esteem. And then out of this investigation would come this report, which would hopefully begin to change California. And his pitch was this: it was that healthy self-esteeming citizens are responsible, productive, creative, and satisfied workers who are not absent from the job. They will make America competitive again. Rings any bells? Moreover, that's what he said, just by raising self-esteem, you can help solve a massive array of chronic social problems, including child abuse, educational failure, teenage pregnancy, that was a big moral panic at the time, alcohol and drug abuse, welfare dependency, crime and violence, problems which cost the state of California billions of dollars every year. So that's an amazing thing. He's saying the reason we have all these problems is because people don't love themselves enough. And if you can convince them to love themselves, all of these problems will vanish. He called self-esteem a social vaccine. It's literally like a vaccine to make you just believe you're amazing and you'll become amazing. So he promised that he would prove this scientifically. He said in his pitch that we know scientifically there are causes and effects. If you give people high self-esteem, they get, you know, children in schools, they get better exam results. And then, so when this was announced, he became the object of absolute ridicule all over America and the wider world. He became the target of jokes on Johnny Carson, on The Tonight Show, were teasing him. There was a famous cartoon strip which was syndicated all over America at the time. Everybody read it, called Doonesbury. And the guy who made the Doonesbury cartoon did a 2-week run of cartoons specifically devoted to taking the piss out of the self-esteem task force. He created a new character, Barbara Boopsie Ann Boopstein, a 25-year-old actress and spiritual medium who channeled a 213,055-year-old warrior named Hunkra, who had been invited onto the task force on the basis of her 20 years of feeling good about myself and out-of-body experiences. In an editorial, the New York Times said, California is a state that produced Jerry Brown, the People's Temple, Sister Boom Boom, whatever that is, drive-in churches, Charles Manson, the Esalen Institute, and now a governmental task force to promote self-esteem. So now there's one more California joke to at cocktail parties around the nation. And the Wall Street Journal story bore the headline, maybe folks will feel better if they got to split the $735,000, which was the funding for the task force. Vasco was furious about all this. He felt completely humiliated. He felt they were ignorant, and he declared publicly that the problem with all these journalists and comedians was they had low self-esteem. That's what he said. So he was an absolute object of ridicule. And then, you wouldn't believe it, 3 years later, the report was published, and he announced that he'd found that it was true. he'd recruited a team of psychologists and scientists from the University of California system to look into the problem of self-esteem, and they had found that it was true that if you raise self-esteem, it really did make people happier and more productive and all those amazing things. And the journalists were amazed, but they accepted it. Time magazine had a headline saying the sneers are turning to cheers. This proof was reported in the Times in London, in Australia. Vasconcelos was even invited to the Soviet Union to talk to the Communist Politburo about how to raise their self-esteem. The task force got hold of Oprah Winfrey and sold her the idea of self-esteem, and she loved it. She decided that self-esteem was going to be, she called it the catch-all phrase of the 1990s. She had a self-esteem special, and the guests were, who were the guests? There were Maya Angelou, Drew Barrymore, and John Vasconcelos himself. So this idea became viral. It became absolutely massive, and it changed everything. It changed the way we raised our children. It changed the way we taught our children. If anybody here is my age, has got any Gen Xers in the group, in the audience, you will have gone to school in this era in which the most important thing was that you loved yourself. That was the important thing. If you got into trouble, as I was always doing, your problem was that you just didn't have enough self-esteem. That was your problem. Evil people were evil not because they were evil, but like Hitler was Hitler because he didn't love himself. That was the idea. Amazing. But that was the idea. So I wanted to investigate this as part of my book. So I did some research into this self-esteem movement. And part of that research involved looking at the actual report. And there were 25 members of this self-esteem task force, and they all signed the report, except for one man. And this one man's name was David Shanahoff-Kelser, who didn't sign it. So I tracked David Shanahoff-Kelser down to his home in Santa Barbara, went to visit him, and he said that it was all a cover-up. It was all basically a massive lie. He said, I was in the room with John Vasconcelos when he got the scientific reports back from the scientists, and he said, in these were his exact words, if the legislature finds out what's in these reports, they'll cut the funding to the task force, and then it all started getting brushed under the table. So basically, they started lying about all the data, they started lying about all the science. When Kelser actually pulled out this huge red book, which actually had the actual science in, it wasn't the report, the little thin report they issued to the media, it was the actual science. He read to me their conclusion, and the conclusion is this. The news most consistently reported is that the association between self-esteem and its expected consequences are mixed, insignificant, or absent. They'd made the classic correlation-causation error. So they'd seen that children at schools, for example, who had high self-esteem had better grades. So Vasconcelos had assumed that the high self-esteem had caused the better grades. And of course, as we know now, it's the other way around. The good grades cause the self-esteem. So it was an enormous lie. I tracked down the head of I tracked down the head of the group of scientists, a guy called Neil Smelser, and he said, well, the fact is that Vasconcelos was head of the Ways and Means Committee, which was he controlled all our funding, he controlled all our money. So it wasn't that he said, either you work with us or your funding is cut. He just sort of suggested it in a kind of slightly threatening way. He said, wouldn't it be a good idea if the university could devote some of its resources to this problem? And of course, when they started misrepresenting the science, they didn't feel particularly motivated to stand up and say, no, that's wrong. They just sort of let it happen. He also said the task force would welcome all kinds of good news and either ignore or deny bad news. I found that this was a quasi-religious movement, and that's the sort of thing that happens in those dynamics. And what happened was that, and there was a kind of right-hand man at Vasconcelos called Andrew Mecca, who was a kind of a politician. And I interviewed, Vasconcelos died a few years ago, so I couldn't speak to him, but I did speak to Andrew Mecca, who's completely unapologetic about their lying, essentially. And he said, what happened was they got the report, and then they spent an enormous amount of money on PR. And they went around all the editors of the TV news channels and the magazines and the newspapers selling the idea directly to the editors. He said, here's a quote, "We made the effort to go around to the editorial boards. John and I could spin a pretty good story together. They knew John, they knew his power, and I could add some considerable enthusiasm. And remember, then somebody walks right out of that room and crafts the editorial for next day's paper. That's good spinning." So he was completely unapologetic about all this stuff. And it has a terrible effect. So there's a psychologist in America called Professor Jean Twenge, and she's famous for her work which looks at narcissism rates in young people in America. And she has found that rates of narcissism in young people begin to wobble in the early 90s, which is sort of 80, I think it was 89 was when they published the report. And then all through the 90s and right into the 2000s, narcissism in young people goes up and up and up and up and up and up and up. So, and that's exactly what psychologists find, is if you tell young people, as I was told and my generation were told, when they're growing up, you're special, you're amazing, you're wonderful, they can be prone to become narcissistic, because that's the age at which we're building our cultural models of the world. We're finding out, who am I? What kind of person am I? And if our parents and our teachers are all telling us we're wonderful and we're special, it's not going to do us a lot of good. There was a very interesting study that looked at this kind of behaviour in a very specific way, done by the University of Amsterdam. I think it was about 500 families over a 2-year span, and they measured rates of what they called overpraise. Parental overpraise, they called it. You're amazing, with rates of narcissism in the children, and they tested them every 6 months, and they found that every 6 months the narcissism in these young children would go up in these overpraised kind of families. So it's a very kind of powerful idea there, and it seems to go with kind of where the data goes in terms of how our culture has changed, kind of post self-esteem movement. And of course that goes into the kind of era of the internet, which is where my book Selfie kind of ends. It's really interesting how people think that the tech companies invented narcissism, and they invented how we are, and they're at fault. I'm not going to forgive them completely, but I think people imbue them with far too much power. When you look at things like Twitter, selfie cameras, it's us as a people who decide how those technologies are used. So when Twitter was first launched, it was a free SMS text message service. It was like a Skype for text messages. It was us that decided to turn it into this kind of quite self-aggrandizing kind of platform for kind of tribal warfare and kind of me reporting. The selfie camera, when it was launched in the iPhone in 2010, it wasn't called the selfie camera, it was called the front-facing camera, and it was launched as a way of talking to your nan on FaceTime, which is, of course, Apple's version of Skype. So it was us that decided to turn the selfie camera into the selfie camera and actually just fill our social media platforms with pictures of ourselves. Silicon Valley are throwing thousands and thousands and thousands of ideas at us, every month, every week, every month. It's us, only a tiny fraction of those ideas get taken up. And then when they do get taken up, we often change the way that they're used. And so what I think is that kind of the kind of technology sector, especially the social media and kind of mobile phone sector, they didn't create this sort of self-obsessed society that we have rather now. They kind of exposed it. It was us that picked up this kind of technology and kind of used it kind of in this way. And of course, that kind of rewinds to this idea of tribalism. What you see in the kind of internet culture today is a kind of a weird, kind of slightly incredible mix of modern Western culture. So, the neoliberal era is a hyper individualistic culture. We're several decades into it now, and it really is, this sense of there's no safety net anymore. There's no welfare state. There's, the pensions are being eroded further and further. It's almost impossible to get on the property ladder for young people now. So the actually economic environment out there is getting harsher and harsher and harsher as neoliberalism and the anti-regulations ideas that come out of that kind of grip in further and further and further. It's creating generations of people who it's really hard for young people, especially for millennials and Gen Z. It's getting harder and harder and harder to get along and get ahead because the neoliberal economy is gripping further and further into us. So that individualism is always increasing. And of course you see that all over the internet. You see that in the influencer culture, in kind of YouTube culture. It's me. There's a lot of me now, but it's not a moral failing of any generation. That's just people being people. It's humans being humans. It's people being born into a particular environment and thinking, who have I got to be to get along and get ahead? What's the ideal of self in this culture? And we see what people become. But within that, you kind of overlaid with all that kind of increased me-ness is all those kind of ancient Pleistocene, Stone Age behaviours to do with tribalism, to do with I'm part of this group and I'm attacking that other group and I will not rest until we win. So it's this kind of crazy mix of hyper-individualism and hyper-tribalism, which social media platforms and internet culture kind of enable and actualize. And that's what we see today. So that's it. That is in nearly an hour, a history of the world. Thank you. So I think we're going to break for a quick, toilet water break, and then we're going to come back for questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So based on patterns of the past, what's the next shift?
Well, this is obviously a bit difficult, but I do think I think everybody can agree we're in a period of turmoil at the moment, and I think the interesting thing for me is to see that both left and right are attacking neoliberalism in different ways. So if you're a typical left-wing person, your problem with neoliberalism is lots of it's about kind of the under-regulation of the banking and business. It's about the kind of gig economy, the kind of unfair ways that businesses exploit people. But if you're a typical kind of classic right-wing person, your problem is less about that, because that to you is competition, and it's likely to be more about issues to do with globalization, because globalization is the big neoliberal wet dream, the idea that we're going to turn the entire planet into one perfect market. And of course that means free movement of people, that means immigration. So what you see on the right is the Brexit Trump mindset, which is neoliberalism has gone too far, globalization has gone too far, we need to build the wall, we need to Brexit and all that stuff. And on the left, you've got neoliberalism has gone too far. We need more regulations on banking and business. We need to protect people. So it's very interesting that there seems to be even though they come from completely different directions, there is a weird kind of consensus between Corbyn and Trump that neoliberalism has gone too far. What the answer is, I don't know. Where it's going to go, of course, I don't know. But I do think that indicates that there is change is going to come. And I also think it's interesting that the big political shifts, since about 2008, I think, since the global financial crisis, we've become a much more politicized society, alt-left and alt-right, the extremes, we've gone to the extremes. And it does seem to me that kind of begins with the economy going wrong. You have the Occupy movement, and then that, it's been a kind of an unending chain of moving apart since then. And so I can't prove it, but my suspicion is, because of what we talked about before about the economy is so important to our national sense of self. When the economies go wrong, bad things happen. We saw it in Germany in the 1930s and so on. And I do think that a lot of the problems we've got today have their kind of unconscious roots in the global financial crisis and all the problems that began with that.
Okay, next question.
One at the front. Oh, okay. Yeah.
Thank you for that. I've never quite heard a whistle stop of human history done. My question is, I know you've written extensively on the art of literature and how the science of literature and how literature across the ages speaks to us in the human condition. But I wanted to ask, what about ancient tragedy, particularly in ancient Greece? How is that any different, and how does it transform the understanding of the self and the human condition? Are we meant to see it as a vehicle through which we envisage the worst possible form of ourselves, or is that a little bit too pessimistic?
No, well, I think for me, tragedy is about. So all story really is about finding out who we have to be. As I said in the talk, we spend those 20 years of our life kind of working out who we have to be, who are good people, who are bad people. And a big part of that is storytelling. Storytelling is a form of play, really. It's how we kind of experiment and we're told stories. And archetypally, the archetypal kind of heroic narrative tells us who we should be. Courageous, selfless, bold, stick up for ourselves and other people. But tragedies tell us who we shouldn't be. This is what happens if you don't change. This is what happens if you don't, see your flaws and kind of fix them. And one of the interesting things that I found when I was writing Selfie was that I contacted some experts in literature and some psychologists who were experts in literature in East Asia. In particular, there's a guy called Wichel Kim, who's a professor over in South Korea, to talk to him about differences in story forms, East versus West, and how they relate to these ideas of geography of thought. And he said one of the big differences is in the quality of the hero. So all over the world, heroes are selfless, because that's that tribal universal. But the cultural kind of weirdness that's over on top of that changes how heroes express themselves. So he told me that in the West, especially in ancient Greece, post-Greek literature, heroes are individualistic. We fight monsters and come back the lone hero, with all our boons for the community. But he said in East Asia, it's much more likely that heroes will sacrifice themselves for the good of the group, for the family, for the king, whoever. So yeah, I think when you look at storytelling and the conception of the hero, what you're always finding are kind of these moral lessons. It's almost like tribal propaganda, really. It's telling us this is who you've got to be, and this is who you shouldn't be. And that's why you see these regional differences. And I think tragedy specifically showing us this is who you shouldn't be. Hi.
I was just thinking, this is only slightly off topic, but more sort of cycling what you were talking about in general, because of obviously what you were saying about the left and right and how we're
Yeah.
trying to figure out where we are and what we're doing. What are your thoughts on these sort of this sort of appearance of the intellectual dark web, like Joe Rogan and John Peterson and sort of people like this that are starting to go against the grain of what's been coming about of the last couple of years or so?
Well, it's kind of inevitable, really. I mean, it's a very complex. It's a very complex question in a way, because it's really about how am I going to talk about this? It's really complicated. Okay, so this is the way that I see it. Okay, so we are tribal, and one of the things that we do as humans is that we've broken free of being in physical tribes that are in competition, and now we're able to be in psychological tribes. So people are members of all kinds of different psychological tribes at once. I'm white, I'm black, I'm Asian, I'm a woman, I'm a man. I'm an employee of this company. I like Starbucks, I hate Costa. We're just unbelievably tribal. We're just members of all these tribes. And when our tribes feel under pressure, we become more tribal, and we kind of act. That kind of tribal identity comes to the fore. And I think what you're seeing, at least my kind of idea of what we see in culture, is this constant battle for tribal territory fought in a kind of psychological realm. So that's kind of, it's a battle of ideas. And, what defines our tribe is one of the things that I think is really interesting and explains so much about what goes on the internet and politics and elsewhere is that tribal markers aren't just what we wear, they're also what we believe. The things that we believe are tribal markers. So I believe this, and people who don't believe this are evil, they're in the other tribe. And this kind of competition for dominance, what you see on the individual level are these tribal warriors trying to convert people, I want to kind of evangelize my tribal beliefs and therefore adopt you as a member of my tribe. And so that plays out on the individual level when people are arguing in pubs. It plays out on the internet. It plays out in politics. It plays out in the media. And I think if you look at it that way, what you can see that what's happened since the financial crisis, beginning of the social media age, is that this kind of alt-right ideas have become dominant in politics. So the right are winning politics, Brexit, Trump, but the left are winning culture. The BBC, university system, and they're kind of new, kind of more extreme versions of left and right. So with the intellectual dark web, the way I see that is that because this kind of new kind of alt-left, it's moved away from the centre, it is now it's winning. It's winning that cultural tribal battle in the media, on the internet too, like Google and Twitter and Instagram are all very keen to be seen as part of that movement. So of course there's going to be people who don't agree with that. And actually I think a lot of the ideas which are called intellectual dark web, they just used to be centrist ideas. Some of them are centre-left, some of them are centre-right. I don't think they're particularly extreme, but it's all a matter of perspective and where you're starting off from. And I think they're incredibly popular because they're the people who are left behind by this kind of tribal battle for dominance in the kind of cultural sphere. Does that make any sense at all? Yeah, it does. Okay, good.
ancient Greece and everything, we're all very big on individualism.
Mm-hmm.
And then also around about the same sort of time we have the emergence of Christianity with Jesus as the ultimate martyr of self-sacrifice. Do you feel like that's perhaps, that maybe because like a reaction against that, or is it Jesus being an exercise in covert narcissism, like look how self-sacrifice?
He's such a narcissist, Jesus. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think Jesus is certainly in the UK. It's not. I mean, it's always. I mean, it seems to be a kind of he seems to be a fading figure. Poor old Jesus, at least in the UK, that seems to me. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that the research I did for Selfie kind of threw into relief was that, of course, Christianity is an Eastern idea. So that idea that he defined his heroism by his sacrifice is a very Eastern idea, and actually did knock us into this collective, obedient kind of state. But also one of the things that you see, and it kind of really, when I went to this Benedictine monastery and lay under my bed, and over all the beds, they've got the crucifix with Jesus, and he had the pelvic V-line. He was so sexy, and I just thought, my God, it's so Greek, and you can see how that, how Greek ideas were underlaying all those kind of Christian ideas. But yeah, no, I hadn't really thought about the idea of him as being this covert narcissist before. I like the idea, but it's kind of true. Well, but one of the things that I found really interesting, and I haven't really got to the bottom of, is the idea of these cultural leaders. Because when you look back at our evolutionary history, one of for me, the most surprising thing is that they didn't really have leaders of those tribes. You imagine they had this sort of violent alpha male type who might kind of dominate everybody, but they weren't egalitarian as such, but they were much, much more egalitarian than human tribes are now, including Christianity. There was no Jesus figure in a human hunter-gatherer tribe, and things would be decided among the group. So evolutionary psychologists call it the tyranny of the cousins. There wasn't a tyrant at the top. There was a group of people who were all deciding what we're going to do next. So my guess is that the idea of leaders, which of course we see everywhere, from Jesus to Steve Jobs to whoever, it comes from a much earlier point in our evolutionary history, before we were human and when we were still much more apish, because in ape troops you do see a dominant leader at the top. So it's a very vague answer because I don't quite know the answer to the question, but those are kind of my sort of rough ideas about that. Yeah.
How do you see the sort of individualistic perspective sort of faring in the longer term, given that we depend on these societies of minutes that only like ants and termites live on societies the scale that we do, like no other mammals ever had in evolutionary history. So I mean, how is this going to work?
Well, I think so. One of the things I was keen not to do in the book was to kind of pick a team, because I think it's kind of intellectually dishonest. And when you get into massively complex ideas like individualism versus collectivism, you can't say which is best, which is the right one and which is the wrong one, because it's not. They're so complex, and it's kind of a trade-off. And so there are good things about collectivism, and there are bad things about collectivism, and there are good things about individualism, and there are bad things about individualism. And the good thing about individualism is it kind of works with individualistic societies and individualistic ideas like capitalism and neoliberalism and sort of the market economy. They work in concert with pre-existing kind of biological drives in humans. We all want relative status, and what individualism does is it says you're important, and if you go on that journey you want to go on anyway, which is to get more and more status, so we're going to reward you, and everybody, and society will get better because you'll come up with amazing ideas. But like any idea, it can go too far, and so as a long-term strategy, I think neoliberalism, as much as I'm a critic of it, is also raised millions of people out of poverty in developing countries, because And that's one of the, sort of the incredible things about kind of globalization. So it's an amazing idea. It could be one of the best ideas we've ever had. It's the idea that human rights comes out of that idea. The idea that the individual is more important than the group. You know, anti-racism and, you know, not seeing people by the colour of their skin, their sexuality, all of that stuff comes out of individualism. So it's a fantastic idea. But like all ideas, it can go terribly wrong. And I think we're at that point now. I think we're at that point. Things like the Grenfell disaster show us we're past that point. The global financial crisis shows us that we're past that point. So it's a complex question, and I think you can't answer it. I think it's our best chance for a great future, but I think it does need to have collective voices thrown into it to moderate it and to make sure that the kind of crazy libertarians don't take over, which might happen.
Did you believe people would change their sense of self? So, for example, we've just had a lecture by Kevin on Jungian individuation and about isolation being helpful. How they changed their concept of what's important to them and meaning, and then the morning on absolute and transcendence. Do you think, have you interviewed people that changed their very self-idea of who they are? What did you learn from speaking to those people? And do we need a new concept of self to survive in today's society where ecological crisis, etc., beyond the selfie sense of self?
I've met people who have gone through big changes in self, yes. So to me, they're really rare people. They're kind of heroes, really. The people that have kind of have the kind of courage and bravery to kind of really change. So I have interviewed a few of those people, and I did seek them out specifically because they changed, and I was interested to know how they changed. And so one of these individuals was a guy called John Pridmore. And John Pridmore was a gangster, like a proper East End gangster who would walk around. He'd go to work with a needle leather trench coat with a special pocket sewn into it for his machete, and another special pocket for his Jif lemon bottle, which had acid in it, which he'd spray into your eyes. So he was not a good man. And he said he nearly killed somebody. And his boss, who worked for, he was a muscle for a firm, a standover man, they call him in Australia. I love that phrase. And he went home and he smoked, and he said, "You need to go home for the weekend because you're going to get arrested and sent to prison. So stop nearly killing people." And he went home. He smoked a very strong spliff, and his television started talking to him, and it started listing all the things that he'd done. And he immediately, in his perception, realised that it was the voice of Satan saying that you're going to go to hell. And he ran outside, fell to his knees, prayed for forgiveness, felt the love of the Lord pouring into him, went round to his mum's house. His mum was a Catholic, and it was 2 a.m, he knocks on the door, and he said, Mum, I found God. And she went, "At 2 o'clock in the morning?" And now, John Pridmore is a Catholic evangelical kind of preacher dude who goes around. So I've interviewed a few people like that. So there's him. There's a guy called Mark Linus who was an eco-terrorist, staged the first, helped organise the May Day riots, staged the first ever Monsanto sit-in in the UK, and is now a pro-GM foods kind of campaigner. And there's a guy whose name escapes me who was a 9/11 truther and had a big conversion against kind of conspiratorial thinking. And what the thing that connects them all to me is that they've all have things in their past which are so the big idea I've been pursuing through all my work really is the idea that the self is a story. The brain is a storyteller. It tells a story about who we are and how the world works. And people at least in my research, the ones that have gone through massive changes are the ones that have latent in them alternative stories that just sort of click in. So Mark Linus, although he was a eco-terrorist and all that stuff, his parents, I think his dad was a scientist. So it immediately made sense to him, this other scientific idea about GM foods. The 9/11 guy, if I can remember properly, he was a scholarship boy at a very posh school who was bullied by the rich, entitled, dominant people, and when he was looking out at the world and seeing, and was kind of, and he also, before that, lived in Saudi Arabia with his dad, who worked for an oil company and was walking through a mall one day with his girlfriend holding her hand, and they got arrested by the moral police, and they called his girlfriend a whore and a slag, and it was a very upsetting experience for them both. So he had in him, again, both those, the idea of the West of these dominant, privileged bullies, but also this idea of people in that part of the world being awful and moralistic and anti-Western. So he had in him kind of these two kind of different latent ideas. Sorry, this is turning into a very long answer. So that's kind of my idea about these rare people who are able to go through these big transformations in perception. They're kind of special people because they have very powerful conflicting experiences inside them. John Pridmore, by the way, was raised Catholic, but never really believed it until, and of course when he heard the television speak to him, he immediately, his brain already had an alternative story to explain that situation in his head, which was, oh, it's the devil. Oh, suddenly it made sense. So he had basically had a nervous breakdown, John Pridmore, as far as I'm concerned, but he never went to hospital, he never went to the doctors, because his brain was able to immediately tell a make-sense story about the world that gave him function. So that's my idea, is that these people who change are kind of special people because they have unique experiences which enable them just to flip. Does that make sense? A bit?
I think you to elaborate on that a little bit more. You said that these people found a sort of logic that worked for them. I'm kind of wondering, why do humans do that? Why do we make up stories to kind of benefit our own story?
So that's a big question. Okay, yeah. So you often hear it said that the self is a story, which sounds like one of those glib, annoying TED Talk things that Deepak Chopra might come out with. But it's actually true, and the way to understand that it's true is you flip it. And it's actually a story is like a self. So the reasons that we tell stories in the way that we do, that are structured, in the way that they're structured, is because that's how a consciousness works. That's how a kind of psychological self works. And it works that way because it has to radically simplify reality. So we're all surrounded by unbelievably complex, confusing, chaotic information at all times. And so the brain is always simplifying in order to kind of make sense of it all. And it doesn't really care about what's true, it just cares about what makes sense in a specific way. And so healthy brains are kind of, I call them hero makers. Their kind of primary interest is making you feel like the heroic self at the center of the world. And so there are so many kind of biases and prejudices that kind of power that delusion. One of the most kind of disturbing ones, they call it depressive realism. And when they test clinically depressed people's views about themselves, about the world in general, about the possibilities for the future, with happy people, they find depressed people are more accurate in their predictions than happy people, which shows that happiness is this kind of delusionary state. And of course it is, we're all going to die, the world's going to implode, the sun's going to explode, and everything, there's no real reason to get out of bed in the morning, but the brain has to give us this story. Yeah, it's going to be amazing. You're going to be amazing. You're going to get out there. You're going to smash it. Your kids are going to be so successful. That's what the brain wants to do. So that's the story it's telling you. And again, like everything, it's telling you that so you can all the better achieve your Darwinian aim. So you can get up, get out there, survive and procreate. And feeding into that story, of course, is that awful original sin, that fact that we're tribal and we see the world in groups in competition with other groups. And one of the, if not the most powerful bias, is the moral bias. So the brain loves telling us that we're morally good people. No matter what we do, no matter what we think, it finds a way, a loyally way of allowing us to believe that we're good people. And so that's a really powerful one. And again, I think that explains so much of what goes on in the world that we get confused about. We think we're good. The most important thing, if we're psychologically healthy and not clinically depressed, is that we feel like we're morally good people. Yeah, we make mistakes, we sometimes get things wrong, we have regrets, but ultimately we're good people. And that means that we have to kind of divide the world into kind of heroes and villains. And that's another part of that storytelling brain. So in short, it's just the way that we human beings, attack the world and in such a way that we achieve our Darwinian goals. We tell this amazing story about the world. Yeah.
that's what we've got time for. Let's give Will a huge round of applause.
Thank you.